You know, kids, I'm sure we'd all like to remember actor Dirk Richter for his portrayal of Radioactive Man and not the sordid details of his final years. So let's keep the questions tasteful, okay? Now, how about a big welcome for Buddy Fallout Boy Hodges?
Any questions?
When Radioactive Man got injected with shrinking serum in issue 234, how come his costume shrinks too?
I am sure I don't know. But I did just finish playing Rum Tum Tugger in the Second National Touring Company of Cats. Anybody see it?
Over here. Fallout Boy. Me.
Yes, you, the masked boy.
Do you think the ghost of Dirk Richter haunts the bordello where his bullet-riddled body was found?
Dirk Richter was a beautiful man. Can't you little vultures leave him alone?
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace the creative evolution of the series and count down, finding the exact moment in which it began its inevitable decline. I'm Erix Antoine, and this week it is my sincere pleasure to welcome Clay McCormack, a comic book artist and also very prolific podcaster who co-hosts several shows over on the Pensky File. I'm a really big fan of his work, and it's great to sit down with him today. We'll be discussing the episode 3 Men and a Comic Book, which originally aired in the US on May 9th, 1991. In this episode, Bart becomes obsessed with purchasing a copy of Radioactive Man number 1. When a horrifying part-time job yields meager results, he convinces Martin and Milhouse to pool their money to buy the comic, only to see it destroyed by their selfishness and inability to share. It's a very funny episode that dives very convincingly into the world of comic book fandom and also tells a really good story, which transcends its very specific cinematic and cultural references. Clay and I are about to break it all down, so without further ado, here we go. Hey, so welcome, Clay. It's really good to have you here, man. I'm a really big fan of the stuff you do over on Pensky File, all those podcasts that you do with Wes over there. I'm a really big fan. I'm really happy that you agreed to come on for this episode.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. It only took me 5 or 6 years of podcasting and screaming from the rooftops how much of a Simpsons fan I am for someone to ask me to come on to a Simpsons podcast. So thank you for making my dreams come true.
That's great. I'm so happy that I could do that for you. And yes, in fact, I decided to ask you to come to do this particular episode because we're doing 3 Men in a Comic Book, and I thought that might be a fun one to do specifically. And I thought we could start, before we get into the episode proper, I thought we could start by discussing our relationship with comic books.
Sure.
As, you know, so why don't you go? I'd like you to start off. I'd like tell us a little bit about your relationship with comic books.
Sure. Well, I've been a comic book reader and fan for, I don't know, 25 years, since I was like 8 or so. Pretty much since I picked it up the first time, it became a career goal to be one who draws comic books. And I've been doing that for technically like 10 years, but only really specifically focused in on it for like maybe 6 or 7 at this point. That's as long as I've been doing comics exclusively. And yeah, this episode of The Simpsons really resonated with me when I was a kid, because back in the early 90s, there was no real comic book stuff. It was starting to, Batman the Animated Series was starting to come out. You had the X-Men stuff was starting to come out, but it was like there were no movies really except for Batman. So anything that was even tangentially related to comic books, I was all in on it. Like I even watched a made-for-TV movie on Fox called Wolverine with Antonio Sabato Jr. in it, just because on the off chance that maybe it had something to do with the comics, which it absolutely did not. Yeah, so I've been a fan for a long time. Even though I've been drawing them, I still remain a fan. And yeah, what about yourself?
Yeah, well, me, much like yourself, ever since I was a kid, been a big, really into comics. The story of how I got into them basically is because I grew up in New York City in Chinatown, lived in a loft, and so my parents would have a lot of roommates, I
Mhm.
suppose, to help pay for what even in the 80s would have been an expensive housing proposition in New York City. And one of the roommates that lived with us for about, I want to say, close to a year was this guy named Craig.
Mhm.
And he was very much into two things. He was very much into wrestling and comic books. And my dad sort of took him aside and said, "Look, it's cool. You can hang out with my kid. Do not get him into wrestling. I hate that shit. But and whatever else, like, is fine, you know."
Sure.
And so and he had this stack of like. One time he went on a trip. He was still living with us, but he had like this stack of Marvel comics because he was a hardcore collector. So he'd buy two copies, one to read and one to bag.
Mhm.
Right.
Mhm.
So essentially, he'd pass me like his stack of the reading ones. Right. He'd just pass them on to me. So he gave me this huge stack of comics. They were all Marvel comics, and that's where I really started reading them. And the one that I really gravitated towards was Spider-Man
Mhm.
because among that stack he had like this would have been like 85, 86, and he
Sure.
had like Marvel Tales featuring Spider-Man, where they were doing like the reprints of the 60s stories. They were reprinting them in
Mhm.
this thing called Marvel Tales. And so that's what I really started reading. That, and then that came around the same time as that was concurrent with he had a whole bunch of it's Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man.
Sure. Yeah.
And the Peter David Rich Buechler run. And I still remember the very first comic was one of those, and the cover had like it was Spider-Man and Peter Parker. It was like this effigy of Spider-Man and Peter Parker, like burning on the cover, right?
Oh,
And I was like,
cool.
"Ooh,
Okay.
that's like literally the first comic book I ever like read." And I looked at that one, and I was like, "Whoa, this is cool." And I still remember one panel. The villain was this guy named Blaze, and I don't remember much else about it.
Mhm.
But I do remember like the panel where Peter Parker actually discovers that like effigy outside his office or outside his apartment or whatever, and he's like, "Blaze, it has to be," and somehow he knows. That panel has stuck with me, and it's something that I often even I'll just say like whenever I get like anxious about something, I'll just go like, "Blaze, it has to be," and somehow he knows. So that's how I started, and then obviously it became a huge fan
Was that your
throughout.
first? Was that your first comic? That one specifically, or did you get like you got a whole stack of them?
It was a whole stack, but that's like the
Yeah.
first one that I read. That one caught my eye first, and I started reading it. And of course, I knew Spider-Man because of I was watching the cartoon. Like Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends was on Saturday mornings. Of
Mhm.
course, I was familiar with the character, but I hadn't like read any of the comics. So that's where I really started to really get into it. So he's always been like my favorite comic book superhero. Has
Do you
always been
still have it?
Spider-Man. Not here. No,
No.
it's stuck in a box somewhere, maybe.
It's funny to me, or interesting, that it seems to me generally comic books get passed down. Like the love of comic books it starts because you get introduced to it by someone else, whether it's a friend or a relative. Like I know my cousin specifically is the one who got me into it, and I still have the first comic that he gave me, which I think he just gave me, is like, yeah, take this one. I don't care about this one. But it's like that was the one that everything kind of clicked for me on.
Yeah, no, yeah, I hear you. It's and you're right. It is everything is kind of passed down because whether it's comic books and whatever it is, you're right. I mean, but that kind of thing does tend to be passed down because my love of Mad Magazine was also
Mhm.
passed down. It was like
Sure.
my older cousin, gave me a whole stack of Mad magazines. Just sort of here you go,
Yeah.
and that's how I discovered that. That kind of happened concurrently with this. So it all kind of happened at the same time, and it's weird. And I didn't like get really into it, quote unquote, as a collector until sometime in the 90s. I got
When
really
everybody
into
else did, right?
yeah, pretty bad,
Yeah.
basically. I mean, like, and hang on, and when I tell you what it was, you'll probably be like, well, of course that's what it was.
Uh-huh.
But what it is that I was sort of like, I picked up in a newsstand. I picked up getting out of the subway, coming home from school. I picked up a copy of Superman Man of Steel #1,
Mm-hmm.
which was, and they made this thing on the cover like #1, and from this point on, a new Superman every week, because that's
Oh,
that's
sure. Yeah.
they had like the triangle numbers on the covers, and so at that point I began to collect Superman comics. So for me
Was
it was
that
like
was that the John Byrne Superman?
that. Well, no, that's post that.
Oh,
John
it
Byrne
is.
had
Okay.
already by that point. By that point, Dan Jurgens was on
Oh,
Superman.
sure. Okay. Yeah.
But it is basically the continuation of what Byrne started in
Mm-hmm.
'86, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I did have a few of those, but I wasn't like I had the Man of Steel miniseries and whatever. But that's where I began to really collect. Like, I got a few back issues. Then at that point I started to collect Superman comics. So even though I moved down here in like '92, then what ended up happening is I'm living here, but I had like a deal with the comic book shop that was near my uncle's office in
Mm-hmm.
Queens. And so it was basically my uncle was picking them up for me and just like shipping them down to me every couple of months so
Oh,
that I
that's
could keep up
awesome.
with
Yeah.
my collecting. So it was great. I was able to keep up with it for a while, and then eventually, for boring reasons, it stopped. But my point is that I had a whole bunch of like that was the hardcore collecting part.
Mm.
And yeah, so that's Superman, like I said,
Yeah.
everybody got really, especially the whole death
Oh,
storyline.
yeah.
That was a
Absolutely.
big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. When I discovered comic book stores, it blew my mind because I was only getting them for a while when I was a kid from newsstands and convenience stores. And so when I discovered, wait, there's a whole store dedicated to this that has more than just 5 issues from varying months on a spinner rack, that really kind of, oh, and I can also buy old ones. This is amazing. And that was sort of a new era. And that all happened like in the boom in the 90s of the collecting boom and all that kind of stuff is when I got into it. Ironically, I was more of a collector when I was a kid than I was someone who like really focused on like the art and stuff, which I did. I think I was a more of a story person than I was an art person at that time. But like, my given my eventual career path, you'd think I'd be a little bit more focused on the drawing. But at that time as a kid, it was very much, I need to get a copy of X-Men #1. Oh crap, they just killed Superman. I have to get a copy of that. What? It's $50? I don't have $50. I empathize with the kids in this episode very, very well.
We can actually segue into it with what you just said. But first of all, though, here's the thing. So this begins in a comic book convention,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I need to say something right now. I've never been to one.
Okay, sure. I had never been to one until I was in college, actually. So I didn't. That was another thing where it's like I knew they existed, kind of, but it was not really in my orbit so much until it became part of my job. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize I could go to these and possibly get work. I thought it was just a bunch of guys in a basement trading comics with each other. Much like you see in this episode.
Right. Well, that was actually to my point. The reason I brought that up is because would a place like Springfield even have a comic book convention?
Yes.
Okay.
All like right. This one, absolutely. Because the thing to understand is the comic book convention culture that exists now is very, very recent. I went to the first New York Comic Con, which was in 2004, I think, or yeah, it was either 2004 or 2003. And it was like more or less a sized up version of this. So I was actually there a couple years ago, maybe 2018 for the 2018 New York Comic Con, and they had shifted the building around and stuff because they were doing it's at the Javits Center, this massive convention center. I was walking around and I went into Artist Alley where they set up all the artists and they're doing everything, and I looked around and I realized the room that was Artist Alley, that was just Artist Alley, was the entirety of the convention the first year they did it. So this stuff has exploded. I went to the Boston Comic Con in 2009, was in the basement of a hotel, and it was like, I don't know, I couldn't give you a square footage, but like you could very easily see every wall in the place,
Sure.
And it was a lot more like this. And outside of the big cities, smaller cities, they still do conventions, and they do a lot more like this, where it's a lot smaller, it's a lot more back issues and stuff. Like it's like 4 or 5 comic stores will get together and all bring their stuff, and that's sort of it, and maybe they'll have like a handful of talent, which they're not bringing in the big guys, but they've got some smaller, it's something I would be at basically. So I could definitely see Springfield doing a show exactly like this, at least until they upgrade to Bimon Sci-Fi Con. Is that what it is? The bi-monthly sci-fi convention?
Yeah, right. Well, good point, actually, because something that has to be pointed out, this is 29 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, this aired in 1991.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in 1991, that's what a comic book convention was.
Absolutely.
Basically. It was, as you described it, you walk into a large basement and just there's a whole bunch of quote unquote nerds there. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is. That's all it is.
Yep.
That's something that I hadn't really considered because, of course, as you said, comic book shops existed always. And, there's the Androids Dungeon, right? That's the name of the comic book shop in Springfield. So, of course, I frequented them. And much like yourself, I mean, for me, it was a magical place. Forbidden Planet in New York City was a magical place. A magical place. They moved it, man. It's no longer on the corner. Like when it was the corner location on that block, it was a corner location. It was amazing. It was amazing. It had 2 floors. It was amazing. They moved it a little further up. Like it's right next to the Strand bookstore on the same block. It's right up next to the Strand bookstore. And it's just kind of, like it no longer has that magical quality. You walk in there, and you've got the cases with the action figures and the big, like the $200 statues of Captain America or whatever are in the front. But then it's just sort of, I don't know. It's lost something for me. I mean, I love it. Still support Forbidden Planet in any way, but I got to say, I preferred it when it was in the corner location.
I went there a couple times when I was in school. I can't remember. I don't know when they moved. I feel like I went there when they were on the corner because I feel like it was on the corner lot when I went there, but I didn't realize they had moved it.
I don't know when exactly. This would have had to have been at least because the first time that I noticed that it was not in its corner location, because I had this moment of fear because I was back in New York. I was back in New York for the first time in a couple of years. Actually, I'd been away for about a couple of years, and so I was like, I'm going to go to Forbidden Planet, just hang out for a bit. And so I get there and I get to the corner and I don't see it. I see this thing and I go like, no, it can't be. Blaze, it has to be, and somehow he knows. But then I just look, it's further up. So I mean, I'm going to assume it happened maybe a year or two before that. And this would have been 2012.
Okay, so, I was well out of school at that point.
So I mean, maybe they moved somewhere around, maybe shortly before that. So
sure.
Yeah, and rent being what it is, I can imagine why they might have moved, but still, thankfully they still exist. That's important.
Yeah.
Tell you what, I'll show you something very special if you promise to put your grubby little hand behind your back and keep them there. Behold.
Wow, radioactive man number 1.
None other.
I bet it's worth $1 million.
It is, my lad, but I'll let you have it for 100 because you remind me of me.
All I got is 30.
Then you cannot have it.
Okay, so this all centers around a copy of Radioactive Man number 1 for $100. And is that realistic? Radioactive Man number 1 costs $100 in 1991. Does that make sense? Do you think that that's what it would cost?
Well, I don't know what the market is at that point. No, I'd have to check my issue of Overstreet Price Guide from 1992.
Yeah.
I could see it being like if we're actually, honestly, it's probably kind of cheap, really.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Because like, how much would a copy, mint of like Action Comics number 1 go for? Thousands of dollars.
No, I think they sold one of those recently for over $1 million, I think.
Right.
At this point, yeah.
Yeah, that's not surprising at all.
Radioactive Man seems closer to like the 60s era, so like an Incredible Hulk or a Spider-Man or something like that. And they've made a TV show out of it at that point, or sorry, serials. They haven't done a TV show. Yeah, it's probably still on the cheaper end. It's probably closer to like an Incredible Hulk or something like that. I don't. $100 seems cheap. Let's put it that way. I don't know if those kids realize the deal they're actually getting.
Yeah, I mean, because the thing is that, I mean, obviously for a kid, $100 is, might as well be $1 million. But my point is that, but the one thing about it is, though, I think it depends, because there was a period where I thought of selling all my Superman comics. books,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I was thinking of, why don't I see if I get some money from selling these things? I ultimately didn't, and I'm glad I didn't. But to make a long story short, what happened was when I started looking into it, I realized that yeah, I could sell them, but I wasn't going to get much for them.
Sure.
You know, and I kind of like looked around and I talked to some people, and they were like, well, because these had a lot of print. This had a lot of printing. They had huge circulation. Death and Return of Superman, famous story, and guess what? Everybody bought it.
Oh yeah.
They printed I don't know how many thousands of copies of the black bag edition. Yeah, sure. Everybody had that. And not only did everybody had it, because when it came out, it was such a big deal, a lot of people, collectors, went and bought like 50 copies under the assumption this thing's going to be worth thousands of dollars. And guess what? No, it's not, because there are thousands of copies lying around everywhere. Yep. So that could also, you know, I'm guessing maybe a mint of like the black bag edition of Superman, Death of Superman, maybe that goes for $100, but like mint sealed.
Sure.
Maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if the comic was produced in conjunction with the serials, and maybe if Laramie Cigarettes was paying for the production, and they were sending out copies of the comic with every carton of cigarettes you bought, there might be a lot of them out there. So yeah, maybe the price has been pushed down by the number of copies that are available.
Yeah. So it's number one, and I was for me the thing was that, again, going back to the 80s, I was really into like Secret Wars.
Oh yeah.
And just loved that. And for whatever reason, I had both of them. Like I had Secret Wars 1 and Secret Wars 2, which I actually prefer to Secret Wars 1. And I had Secret Wars 2 like beginning at number 2. So it was my obsession to find like number 1 of those. So it's like, I got to find number 1. And I remember the first time I found like Secret Wars number 1, you know, on the cover, you get the Beyonder. He's like, like crystalline and everything. And I was like, yes. And this is, I mean, it wasn't at that point, it wasn't that old of a comic. It was maybe a year old, maybe 2 years old. And so it wasn't that expensive, but it was still expensive. I do remember that. It's still, you know, I had to save up a month's allowance to like buy that or whatever.
I don't have many. Well, so in the 90s during that collector's boom, I realized that I was not, the thing I cared about was not the collector price aspect. It was the story. Which is another reason why I identified so well with these kids, is because they're not buying the book to have an expensive comic book. They're buying it because it's the first issue and they want to read what happens in the first issue. Like
exactly.
You're talking about Death and Return of Superman. I couldn't get my hands on the Death of Superman issue. When they did the return, they did a similar book where it was, instead of a black bag, it was a white bag.
Yeah.
And I got one of those probably because at that point the bubble had already burst and nobody was buying them. But I got that one, and I think I sat on it for maybe, let's be generous and say, an hour and a half before I tore it open. And I still have the bag, because in the back of my head I was like, well, I can still open it as long as I keep the bag. It'll probably still be worth it. So it very quickly dawned on me that it's like, okay, it's not. I'm not a collector because I'm trying to keep these. I'm not putting them in a box somewhere so they appreciate value. I just want them to read them. And what I liked about this is it was very reminiscent of my feeling at the time, as far as comic books and comic book stories go, which was like, you know, what you were saying, you were desperate to find Secret Wars #1, right? And it always felt to me where it's like you get a certain chunk of this story, but then you realize, well, there's more to the story that I haven't read yet. And every time you find one of those, it's like finding one of the Dead Sea Scrolls or something.
Right. No, exactly.
I understand what happened in the second half of Executioner's Song, but I don't know how we got here. So I have to go back and I have to find X Factor 28 or whatever it was, so I can see exactly when Strife shows up from the future and shoots Professor X dressed as Cable and all this kind of crap.
Yeah. No, actually, for me, something that you'd know about this because it seems like you were into those comics. For me, with X-Men, it was Life Death.
Life Death.
I had Life Death 2, and which actually took place several issues after Life Death 1. And
I have never heard of Life Death.
Well, this is from, I mean, that's the thing. I think it was a story called Life Death, which had to do with Storm.
Okay.
Okay. Storm and God, whoever she was like dating at the time.
Forge.
Maybe, but I don't know. I don't even know if it was like. I don't even think it was like a hero. I think it was like just a guy. This
Okay.
guy with like a mustache and like short hair, like kind of balding.
Oh, I just looked it up. I recognize the cover. I've never read it, but I do recognize the cover.
Okay, and that you Life Death 2 or Life Death 1?
The thing that came up for me was like a collection of them, so I assume it was both of them. But
Yeah,
okay.
all right.
Oh yeah, I'm seeing it now. It is Forge. Yeah.
Okay, so Forge. I mean, you're more into it than I am because I was not. I tried to get into X-Men, and at the time I remember thinking that was just way too convoluted for me, so I just stuck with like Spider. I was just like, yeah, this is a little bit too much for me. I couldn't take it. Like I tried.
X-Men is and always has been very convoluted.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, like that's how it was. And same with New Mutants. New Mutants had such great covers, such great covers. So Bill Sienkiewicz, who did all those covers, amazing covers. I was like, I would be like, yeah, this looks great. I start looking at, yeah, but this is, I can't, no, I can't do it. I can't, I couldn't do it. Yeah. Couldn't commit.
Lots of history there.
Yeah, I was too dumb for it, I guess.
Just to jump off one other thing about Secret Wars. The only comic that I do own that was one that I bought specifically because it was a well-known kind of, I don't want to say expensive, it was pricier than I usually go, is Secret Wars, I want to say number 3 maybe, whichever one where Spider-Man gets the black costume. That was one where I was like, okay, I've actually never read that story.
Yeah.
This is a fairly pricey book. It's probably a good one to have. So I grabbed that one. So that's the only one that I have that's like a investment. And even there I think it was like $20 or something like that. I was not breaking the bank getting that one.
Right, sure. Yeah.
Secret Wars. Marvel supervillains are coming. Secret Wars. Can the Marvel superheroes stop them? Here, Dr. Doom and the Doom Platoon. Magneto, Dr. Octopus. There, Captain America and the Champions of Freedom. Spider-Man and Wolverine. Secret Wars. The secret's out. From Mattel.
So yeah, they get the comic book and they well, first of all, it's funny, like when they're reading it, so it gets dramatized in a rather funny way, which for me was very reminiscent of like the 60s Marvel cartoons. I don't know if you ever watched any of those.
Oh yeah,
you know,
definitely.
The ones I'm talking about. With very rudimentary animation, where it was essentially just comic book panels, just sort of shot and with a very limited number of animation, whether it's like Iron Man, you know.
You can basically like see them pulling the cell across the camera to make Spider-Man swing across the city.
Yep. So, and I remember like and actually those continued to air down here in La Paz when I got here, like in the 90s. Those still continued to air like on afternoon television.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I was like, wow, this stuff's old. And so watching the Radioactive Man thing, I was like, oh yeah, they're doing it in the style of the 60s Marvel comics.
My pants. Caught on barbed wire. Good Lord! Joke! An A-bomb! Becoming radioactive. From this day forward, I shall call myself Radioactive Man.
And maybe that's on purpose, since it seems like his origin. Okay, so Radioactive Man basically is, see if you follow my logic. He's essentially like a combination of Superman and Batman, because he's got like the powers, he flies, he's like super strength and all of that.
Yeah.
But he's got like the kid sidekick like Batman. So it's like a combination of those two heroes. But his origin is basically a sort of take on the Hulk's origin.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a mishmash.
I don't know if I would directly say he's a mix of Superman and Batman, because the kid sidekick was a prevalent trope that existed back since the Captain America in the 40s. You know, Captain America had Bucky, Human Torch had Toro, who was just a kid Human Torch. So that's just like so baked into the comic book culture of having a kid sidekick. However, they do definitely treat Radioactive Man more like Adam West than they do anything else. So he's this weird mishmash of whatever comic book touchstone they need him to be. In this one he's in serials, which is hilarious because this is, even if you take out the fact that The Simpsons kind of exists out of time,
Sure.
This is 1992, and these kids are going crazy over serials from like the 40s. Which,
right. Yeah.
Like, it's not even Adam West. I think they do an updated thing with Radioactive Man where he's a little bit more Adam Westy later. But yeah, these are kids who are excited about watching black and white serials sponsored by a cigarette company. So I think, yeah, and you know, they say the thing about his unfortunate death at the Bordello thing, which is a little bit George Reeves and a little bit the guy from Hogan's Heroes.
Yeah, Bob Crane.
So, yeah. So they kind of, he's one of those characters that they kind of, he's the filter for any comic book related stuff they need to do, which is one of my favorite things about the show is everything they have a through line for whatever joke they need to get to. That's sort of a broad example of this thing they're doing, which they can fine tune it however they need it to work. Like Springfield itself. If you need a desert, drive 10 minutes one way, you get a desert. If you need the mountains, drive. If you need the murder horn, drive 10 minutes the other way, you get to the murder horn. So yeah, I would say he's more of a pastiche of just general comic stuff than I would say specifically Superman and Batman. But it is interesting to me that he does have an Incredible Hulk origin story.
Yeah, and it's got that great line.
I would have thought being hit by an atomic bomb would have killed him. Now you know better.
And it reminds me of I'm pretty sure that it's in the Bendis run of Daredevil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure it's Bendis. In like the early aughts, there was a run where I believe Kingpin is killed in this story. They pull a Caesar on him. But anyway, but in that like story, at one point they discover Matt Murdock's origin. I mean, they discover that Matt Murdock is Daredevil, and the guy says something like, "You know what would happen to me if I got hit in the face with a radioactive isotope? I'd get leukemia and die."
Yeah. I don't know if this is too sacrilegious to say on this show, but one of my favorite jokes on Family Guy is there's some catastrophe happening. So Mayor Adam West decides that the only way he can stop it is to get superpowers. So he goes to a toxic waste dump and rolls around in the toxic waste. And then they hard cut to him at the doctor, and the doctor says, "Mr. West, I'm afraid you have lymphoma."
Right, no, it's not sacrilegious. I like Family Guy just fine. I have no problem with Family Guy, to be honest. So particularly the early, the earlier the seasons, the better it is. But yeah, I'm not a hater. But anyway, yeah, that is very funny. And you're right, they're doing a lift. Actually, the idea of kids being really excited for watching like some old serial, it's not, because I do remember Batmania. You know, when the '89 Batman movie came out. I, like many, was obsessed with Batman.
Sure.
So you better believe, I mean, they came out with a bunch of books that were collecting a whole bunch of stories, you know, the greatest Batman stories ever told, the greatest Joker stories ever told. I bought those. But I was like, I wanted to get my hands on everything. You know, I got like the DC archives of like the first issues of like Detective Comics. And then, so obviously around that same time, if you went to video stores, they were really pimping those like Batman serials from like 1930 or whenever it was. And I was like, yeah, I'll watch this, you know, and I'm pretty sure that some people would have felt the same way with Superman, also watching the old like Kirk Allen, like 1930s Superman serial. I think when you get really into something, you want to consume as much of it as you can.
Oh, definitely.
Like they're really tapping. So when you're a kid and you get obsessed with that and you're like, yeah, you'll watch the shitty ass 1930s Batman serial just because you're obsessed with the Tim Burton movie.
Right.
So
right.
It makes sense. Like that doesn't seem that far fetched. And clearly they're not. I mean, you know, Bart doesn't have. He's irreverent enough to not really give a shit to bring up the tragic history of the actor.
Right.
And
right.
basically cause the guy to have a meltdown on stage, which is also a very funny scene.
I like that he and Milhouse are two very different types of fans, and I would identify a lot more with Bart than Milhouse, where Milhouse shows up and starts asking the magic xylophone questions about the comic, whereas Bart is more interested in the see me behind the scenes elements of what actually happened to the guy.
Yeah. No, so, right. They're the realists, right? Like,
Yeah.
because you have the ones who will actually point blank ask William Shatner about like how many decks does the Enterprise have, or like, or
Right.
just like
Right.
why did you meet on deck 30 when like clearly the blueprints show that there is no deck 30 or whatever
Right.
it is,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like, dude, it's a fucking TV show. But
Like when you left your quarters for the last time and you opened up your safe, what was the combination?
Get a life, will you, Pete? I mean, look at you. Look at the way you're dressed. You've turned an enjoyable little job that I did as a lark for a few years into a colossal waste of time.
all right, well, getting back into the episode, I love the Mrs. Glick subplot.
Yeah.
The way that's presented, it's hilarious. Cloris Leachman is really funny. All of those scenes are just extremely, extremely funny. The whole thing is very funny.
Yeah, I don't think I ever realized that was Cloris Leachman. Because usually when I've gone back and watched the show, there's a lot of voices that I didn't know at the time when I was a kid that I recognize now later,
Sure.
being more familiar with their work and different stuff. But yeah, Cloris Leachman is just like a chameleon.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because in my head she just sounds like Frau Blucher from Young Frankenstein, which is a very different voice than this one.
He was my boyfriend!
Yeah, that stuff. What the thing that I found surprising about this episode, having it been so long since I watched it, was the comic book stuff is like the last 8 minutes of the show. It's like the last third of the show.
Yeah.
And there's a big portion dedicated to the Mrs. Glick stuff, and it's an interesting structure. Especially because later on they get into more like A plot and B plot type stuff, where this is basically one story kind of told in 3 separate parts. And the Mrs. Glick stuff is very I don't know if you ever had a job like that, but I never had a job like that where I was paid so little, or at least not
God,
that
no.
little anyway. But I do identify he gets a little bit probably too intense with her at the end, but the fact that she brushes it off pretty easily makes it okay.
Yeah, no, I mean you almost feel kind of sorry for her because like, come on, she's a little old lady. She doesn't know any
Right,
better. You don't
yeah.
have to be that mean part. It's like
I listened to one of your previous episodes, and you were talking about saying how you're looking for the moment where the Simpsons kind of starts to drop off.
Sure.
And for me, it's always been when their references and stories become too current, and they start making a lot more very, very modern references and having like more celebrities on as themselves and stuff like that. And where it really lives for some reason, the core of the show is in episodes like this, where they can just make all of these weird old references that only they're going to understand, but works for the story that they're telling. Because Mrs. Glick is just like an excuse for them to go off and come up with as many old-timey things as they can think of, whether it's like, what does she offer him, like a barley soda or something like that?
Barley pop.
Barley pop, yeah.
And she tells him to spend his 50 cents on penny whistles and moon pie.
Yeah, exactly.
Here, have some ribbon candy. Boys love candy.
No, thanks.
Boys love candy.
Ugh.
Yeah, like that sort of weird. It's weird because when they date the show that way, it makes it more timeless than when they start doing stuff like, even though I do love this episode because it's a crossover with my favorite television show, The Prisoner, I always thought it was weird, the episode where Homer gets a computer and like they go online for the first time, or one of them gets a cell phone, and it's like, I don't know. It just feels like it feels like the show lives so much in that more like throwback timeless era that to see them go so modern always felt like it didn't feel on brand to me.
Well, actually, you know what? That's a very good point, and we can talk about this for a minute. I think because you're right. It's not. See, the way that I've been contextualizing it in my head is because, I mean, I don't actually know. I'm trying to find that drop-off point, but I'm suspecting that it's going to happen towards the end of the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the seasons, or whatever season that is, right? And I think that might be because of what you're saying, because I think when they were a 90s time capsule, And when the writers who were doing the show were boomers, were people like who were reflecting on their own childhoods. And they were making references to stuff that they're going to understand. But it has that timeless quality because it's still, as you're saying, the story works regardless. Because let's look at this. I mean, the entire third act of this is essentially a parody of The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. And it has references to like Saboteur, the Hitchcock film. And it has a whole bunch of stuff like that, which, I mean, let's be honest, somebody today watching that under the age of 40, under the age of 35, let's be generous, under the age of 35, will just be like, what? You know, they're not going to know what that is. They'll enjoy it just as a story. And they might assume it's a reference to something, but they're not going to understand what that is because they probably have never even watched Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
I'll tell you, you have no idea how many jokes from The Simpsons I didn't get all came into focus the first time I watched Citizen Kane. You know?
Yeah, there you go. Yes, where like I believe that they have like I think I read this somewhere that by now, you know, after so many episodes and so many things, you could literally reconstruct the entire Citizen Kane film just using shots from The Simpsons.
I would watch that movie in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting. I think you can clearly like either do that or like a very summarized version of it, but they've pretty much lifted so much from it that it's amazing. But that's the thing, like, you're right. I think that, I guess when it became a current thing, I guess it's because the writers changed. I'm going to assume that that's what it is. So that it's the writers reflecting on their own stuff. It's no longer the boomers, then it's Gen Xers. And then it's millennials who are writing the show.
Yeah.
And when they're writing the show, they're not looking to, you know, 1950s movies for inspiration. They didn't grow up with that. That doesn't have any, you know, they're in the now. They're in the now. So they're all about being edgy and in the now. And like, I don't want this to sound like I'm bashing millennials. That's not what I'm doing. But I'm just saying that's what happened.
Yeah, I found it interesting because I was watching this and it occurred to me there's only one joke in this episode that I think feels really dated. I think the rest of the show works on its own very well. And the humor in the show I think is fairly universal. The only joke that doesn't work anymore is the Wonder Years joke, because I barely get that joke, and because I was young enough to have watched like the last 2 seasons of the Wonder Years, and it was still in the zeitgeist at that time.
Sure.
But like anybody under 30, I doubt is going to get that. You know. That's
true. Yeah, I had that same thought because when it went to that, I go like, right, this is Wonder Years, and plus it's Daniel Stern,
right?
And
right.
I believe his brother is one of the writers. He's one of the writers on The Simpsons, so he like made sure that they got the idiom right, like just got it right.
Yes.
And so it's fine. It's a perfect parody.
Get a job? Were they serious? I didn't realize it at the time, but a little piece of my childhood had slipped away. Forever.
Bart, what are you staring at?
Nothing.
To everything.
That's an example of them doing something that at that time would have been current.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
You know, there was like, oh, the Wonder Years is kind of big right now, so this is a reference that everybody who's watching this is going to get. And yes, they would have. You know, and now, exactly. Yeah, you're right. It's not. I don't know how. I don't know what kind of a dent the Wonder Years made in pop culture. It's not like making a Star Trek reference where people get what that is. You know, I think the Wonder Years is a lot more niche.
I think the brilliance of the show when it comes to that stuff is that they managed to make the references their own joke or scene. So the joke isn't, oh, wink, wink, this is like Saboteur. Oh, wink, wink, isn't this just like the Treasure of the Sierra Madre? Or, oh, wink, wink, isn't this just like Citizen Kane? They use it to its own effect in the show. So when you get to like the monorail episode and they're doing a riff on the Music Man, you're not going like, oh, hell yeah, Music Man. Like it's its own thing. It lives in its own space. And it's not just a reference. It's something that's been synthesized into its own joke, an own thing.
Right. No, exactly. It's not funny because of the reference.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is when you do that badly, that's what happens.
Right.
Like the reference is the joke, but if the reference is the joke, then it's not going to work.
Yeah. You know, and even the Wonder Years joke, I mean, even if you don't know what it is, I think it's still pretty funny. But it's as far as like direct references, that's the one that they really make that I don't think lands anymore.
You're right, because like in that third act, and the treehouse is full of gags that have nothing to do with Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Just
Right,
great lines, stuff like,
You're going crazy, Bart. I'm telling your mom.
Hey, Martin, tell him what we do with squealers.
I don't know. Is it worse than what you do with people that have to go to the bathroom?
My favorite bit of that sequence is when as Bart's getting paranoid about who's going to take the comic when, Martin lays out a very reasonable plan at every stage of the discussion. It was like, well, what about Zero? And he's like, well, in the unlikely case that a Zero shows up, here's exactly what we'll do. And then and then they're like, oh, well, that's, yeah, but I don't know about you anyway. But Bart's plan is very reasonable and makes a lot of sense.
It is very reasonable. The only problem is that was Saturday. So he's like, well, this being Saturday, I'll just take my comic and go. Nice try. Hey there, my podcast listeners, all 7 or 8 of you, please listen up. Do you like the X-Files? Well, then you might be interested in my new podcast, Discovering the X-Files, in which I, a confessed newbie, go through the entire series as longtime fans walk me through it. If you're a fan, here's a good opportunity for you to revisit the series and follow along with me. If you're a newbie like me, then why not jump in and join me on this voyage of discovery? Either way, it's a good talk and a good time. So check out Discovering the X-Files, posting twice a week, Mondays and Fridays, on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms, or on the Erix Antoine Network on YouTube. Hope to see you there. And now back to the Simpsons Countdown. Let's talk for a second about Milhouse. This is something that might relate more. This is something you might be more familiar with than I would be, because I'm not really a baseball guy. Are you into baseball at all? Are you a Sox fan?
I'm more of a Bruins fan, more of a hockey fan.
Okay.
I have, living in Boston, I am a fan of all the sports, but I probably watch baseball the least. I fluctuate. So when I was younger, I think I watched more baseball. I went through a brief basketball phase. The past 20 years has been all football. You can't not watch it. And but I've always been more of a hockey fan in general.
All right, yeah. I mean, I'm not really. I only take an interest if it's a Subway series.
Sure. Yeah.
And even then, it's kind of a passing interest. Like, I'm not really invested one way or the other. But the baseball card that Milhouse wants, what he's trying, is that a real thing? I mean, I know he's a real player, right? But
yes.
Yeah.
Apparently that is a real card. I was listening to a bit of the commentary on the DVD, and during that scene, one of the writers said that was a real baseball card. Yes. And
probably the writer himself must have been obsessed with it.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
With the big sideburns, like they make a real point. Like they make so that there's another reference that, again, who's really going to be into that? Like now, who's going to know? But even then, I think who was going to know?
Yeah.
But it works because it doesn't really matter. It's not about, the joke is not that. The joke is just that that's what Milhouse wants.
Right.
And so at the end, when he's about to, quote unquote, die, he's like, I didn't even want the comic. You know what I mean? Exactly. So like that whole thing.
Yeah, it could have been anybody. It could have been a made up player. It could have been a made up card. It could have been, Alf Pogs. I don't know. It could have been anything.
All right, cool. So is there anything else that we have not brought up that you'd like to point out?
Well, I was just thinking, I find this era of The Simpsons really interesting. Well, first of all, because you see Bartman makes an appearance at the beginning of this, and Bartman was everywhere outside of the show, but I didn't realize until I looked it up, this is the only time Bartman shows up on the show. I should say the first time. The next time is not for 16 years later. And it's just an interesting era to think about, because this is like right in the pocket of when this show really blew up. I don't think Michael Jackson is season 3, right?
Yes. Yeah, he opened season 3.
Yeah. So that's kind of like, I think the Michael Jackson episode is like the peak of the original Simpsons boom. And it's easy to forget how big this show was, how quickly, and then how much of that stuff sort of dissipated off. Because for my money anyway, you don't really get to see the best of this show until like season 4 and on. Like season 4 through 8 are like perfect seasons of television. They're unbelievable. But by that point, they're not doing the crank call thing anymore. They're not doing, Bartman, like I said, he showed up once, even though he's in video games and you can buy toys and stuff. It's a very passing reference. And this is just it's an interesting era of the show because it's very much still the Bart Simpson show. And it hasn't switched over to the Homer Simpson show featuring the rest of Homer's family.
Exactly.
I was wondering what your thoughts about this era are in general as you've been making your way through. Because bless you, you watched the whole first. I haven't watched the first season of The Simpsons probably since it was on because I never thought it was very good.
Well, yeah,
my marker has always been like 2 through 10 are the sweet spot.
Yeah.
But what are your? Sorry if you've talked about this on previous shows, but I'm just curious what your views have been up to this point.
Okay, well, actually, because it's not like I've talked about this in detail, and we are sort of wrapping up the second season. We've got another episode to go, but we're pretty much done, and so it's a good time to sort of reflect on it. And I think I can say, yes, you see the growing pains.
Mm-hmm.
They're very clear, and when you watch like the first season, which is very rough. Extremely rough. I tried watching it now, and I was like, wow, yeah, this was not.
What are the only episodes I can remember from the first season are the one where the first Albert Brooks episode with Marge and the bowling teacher.
Sure.
And the one with the babysitter, who's the crazy killer or something. And I can't remember anything else from the first season of the show. Are there any like standouts from the first season that I can't remember?
I think that Krusty Gets Busted, the introduction of Sideshow Bob, that's a pretty good episode. That's actually I would say that's probably the best episode of the first season in terms of like the way it's written, in terms of its structure. It has more in common with later Simpsons than the first season as a whole.
Sure.
But yeah, it's definitely very rough. If that's where they'd stayed, if they'd stayed in that, it wouldn't have worked. They needed to up the ante a bit, which they did in the second season. And so the interesting thing is that in the second season, you really do see that development. And like a few episodes ago, I came up with a bit of a theory because in the episode about Bart the Daredevil when he jumps, when he's doing stunts on his skateboard.
Yeah.
So I came up with a theory about the opposite of jumping the shark is jumping the gorge.
Okay,
because,
I like that.
Essentially, like I think from that point on, you begin to see a bit of an uptick. It's still an up and down thing, but you still basically, it starts to get a lot better almost immediately from that point on. The episodes really they become more notable. You get things like this one that we just watched. And I agree with you. I think because I'm watching it at a different pace. Like I'm already like myself as of this recording, I'm already up to like season 5, just on my own, just watching it, enjoying it, right? Just for my own pleasure. And you do see that like season 3, it gets even better. It's like it's a constant refinement. And what you pointed out is something that has been on my mind too. In the first 2 seasons, and even in part of the third, there's a lot of the running gags, like what you just pointed out about the prank calling Moe. And, that's one of the things, or little things that they had, which I'm going to say probably what ended up happening is that those running gags were replaced with other running gags.
Sure, definitely.
I guess that's all that happened. I guess, because I know that later on, like Disco Stew and like whatever else.
Yes.
I know that stuff, basically what ended up happening is some things were phased out as the writers changed and other things took their place. But it was funny to me because you're right. I mean, the prank calls were a thing for a bunch of seasons, but then eventually it was like, that's over. We're done.
Yeah,
with that.
and that was so ubiquitous to the show. Like it was like that was the thing that the Simpsons was like, oh yeah, they prank call Moe and Seymour Butts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like that was like one of the top 3 things you'd mention about the show if you were talking about it, and then it was just gone, and it was replaced by this other stuff that like. Disco Stew is not something that had the same cross-cultural impact as calling Moe's, prank calling Moe's did. But I totally see your point. Yeah.
Right. No, there's that, and you've just brought up. You're right. Bartman appears here, and what I'm wondering, because I haven't seen any details about this anywhere, is because I'm assuming that by the time that happened, Bartman already had existed, like on a T-shirt or
Sure.
in some way, in some form, the idea of Bartman had existed. But I guess they just put it into the show as a gag at that point. I don't think, you know, he wasn't a character. He was just you know,
so
God, I don't know what to call it, a meme.
Yeah, I just looked it up very quickly. The song "Do the Bartman" was on the Simpsons Sing the Blues album, which was from 1990. So that would have been before this aired. So that phrase already existed. So yeah, it must have just been like a lateral move from the phrase turning it into a literal thing. Yeah.
Right. Well, they just said, and then I guess since that was, by that point they were already in the pop culture vernacular. So the writers were like, let's do this. Fuck it. It'll be a fun little gag, you know, whatever. It's just funny, you know. So it's like, I'm Bartman.
Get a video game out of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Get a video game. Get one of the dreadful video games out of it, because like the Simpsons games are so bad. Like I don't understand why. Like it's in the history of licensed video games, it's probably like the ratio of like how big the property is to how bad the game is. It's like it's incredible. They're terrible games, every single one of them. I don't understand how that happened.
Great pinball machine though. Bad video games, but the pinball machine is fantastic. I love the pinball machine.
Yeah, that's fine. And okay, you know what? I'll go to bat for the arcade game. The arcade game's fun.
Oh, right. Yeah, the arcade game. That one at least is fun. Like I had the first Simpsons one on NES where you're just Bart like walking around the town throwing cherry bombs at people, and Bart versus the Martians. I forget what it was called.
Oh, the Space Mutants. Yes.
Yes, there you go. Space Mutants.
I could never get past level 2. I hate that game.
Yeah, it sucks. It's terrible. I never played. Is it Simpsons? The driving game? I can't remember what the name of it was.
Hit and Run?
Hit and Run, yeah. Was that I don't remember that.
That came out for the PlayStation 2. That was like a GTA parody. That one was actually pretty good. I'll admit that. That was actually pretty good because it's, you know, it's a GTA thing. So, you know, you get to drive around. It's open world, doing missions.
Sure.
And that, okay. So every game except the arcade game and Simpsons Hit and Run, which I read somewhere, I think they're remastering. So you might get a chance to check it out.
You know what I had that I loved? It seemed like a lot of work for not a lot of payoff once you got it, but it was a CD-ROM back when that was a thing. And it was just a digital 3D explorable version of Springfield. And you didn't really do anything except like walk the streets so it's like first person. It's like basically like Google Maps. Like the street view on Google Maps.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, okay.
But for Springfield. So you could go down all the different streets and you could go to Moe's and you could go to the Quickie Mart and stuff. I think that's all you could do. I don't remember how much interaction there was, but I actually really enjoyed it just because you got to like experience that world in a 3D sense as opposed to a 2D sense, and you kind of just get to spend time there. But as far as like a video game, it was not very good.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's like a fun thing for a fan. I mean, I do remember like a couple of years ago, I went to Universal Studios in Orlando.
Oh, yep.
And, you know, and that had been my first time there in many, many years. And the Back to the Future ride has been replaced by the Simpsons ride.
Yep.
And I had heard about that before I went. And so I was a little bit disappointed, though, not by the ride. The ride's a lot of fun, but I was expecting something better. I was expecting like their recreation of Springfield, quote unquote, to be a little bit more extensive. Like I thought they would have put more into it, but it really is nothing. It's like you have like just a store there, and then like, I mean, there's really very little. And I thought at least, you know, you'd get to see Moe's Tavern and I'm surprised that doesn't exist somewhere.
Well, have you not been there? Was this before? Because they did that eventually. Like if you go there now, they've built Moe's Tavern and they've built the Quickie Mart, and they have a Duff Brewery area, and so they have. Yeah, I went down there 2 years ago, and it's awesome. You go into Moe's and it's decked out exactly like Moe's, and they have
in Orlando.
Yes, in Orlando. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So then I guess this isn't. Yeah, when I went, they still hadn't finished that or whatever.
Yeah, and if you go, you can go through Moe's into like a cafeteria area, and all of the different restaurants in the cafeteria are different restaurants from the show. So like they have like the Frying Dutchman and Krusty Burger and all that kind of stuff. So they did. I think it's been that way for 10 years maybe at this point. Maybe not that long, maybe a little bit less than that. But yeah, it was
probably
pretty
less
cool.
because when I went, unless I just didn't see that stuff. Unless I somehow,
yeah, I don't know.
I mean, because I went with my daughter and I was like really focused on, you know.
Oh,
sure,
yeah.
She was like 12 at the time, and so you know, maybe I just didn't notice it, you know, because we just went to the ride and we were only there for a day.
Oh,
so
sure,
it wasn't, you know,
yeah.
And so it was just like, okay, well, you know, at least we get the ride. All right, fine, let's do the ride. So it's possible that stuff was there, and then me, like a jackass, I actually just missed all of it. So yeah, this was a great talk, man. I'm really glad we sat down and talked about this. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it was a real pleasure, and I'd like to give you an opportunity now. Please go ahead and plug whatever you want to plug, man.
Sure. Well, I have a boatload of other shows that I do. I do a show called the Pensky File with my friend Wes, where we talk about Star Trek. We are currently in the middle of season 2 of Star Trek Enterprise, as well as we're covering Lower Decks, which is the new cartoon that they've been doing. I also do a show about another cartoon show called the Badass Podcast, where I talk about Batman the Animated Series with DC Comics artist Sean Murphy. And I just started a new one. Well, I guess it's been a little while at this point, called the Rotten Horror Picture Show, where myself and my co-host Amanda talk about the Rotten Tomatoes 200 best horror movies of all time list. It's a very contentious list because it's based on like an algorithm, so it's some of the choices are not exactly what you would think they would be. But aside from that, yeah, I have a book coming out next year called Bloody Hell, which is I ran a Kickstarter for it last year, and I've been working on it since. It's a graphic novel about 5 mystically powered Vikings who've been imprisoned for 1,000 years, and they get set loose when their prison's struck by an artillery shell from World War I. And I'm almost done with that, so that should be out next year. And yeah, you can find me on Twitter at DeadMeatComic and on Instagram at CMcCormack, CMCCORMACK 414.
That's great, man. That stuff, all that stuff is great. As I said at the top, I'm a big fan of the podcasts that you do.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
So I'm gonna be providing links for all of this stuff in the episode description. So it really has been a pleasure. So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. This podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Anchor FM, and other podcasting platforms. A brief review might actually help boost the podcast's profile, so by all means, feel free. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends on social media. I would also like to take this opportunity to plug the Pensky File, which offers a cornucopia of film, TV, and music-related podcasts featuring this week's guest, Clay McCormack, and another great dude named Wes Teasdale. Visit thepenskyfile.com to access all of their stuff directly, whether it's their excellent Star Trek podcast, or their movie series, Real Ripe, Real Rotten, or Clay's Rotten Horror Picture Show, and more. It's all great stuff, I promise you. And please check out Clay's work. It's a post-apocalyptic comic series put out by Oni Press called Redline. That's out already. And keep your eye out for the aforementioned Bloody Hell coming soon. Follow him on Twitter or Instagram, and in any case, I will be providing helpful links in the episode description. I'm Erix Antoine. I'll be back next Thursday evening to talk about Blood Feud, in which Bart gives his blood to save Mr. Burns, and the Simpsons get nothing for their trouble, until Mr. Burns has a change of heart and gets them something. Let's leave it at that. Mike Flynn will be here to talk about that one and help me close out the second season of the series and this podcast. And I hope you'll join us. Until then, stay safe out there, continue observing your biosafety and social distancing protocols, because whether your area is opening up or not, we are not quite through this thing, and we need everyone to do their part, keeping themselves and everyone else healthy. And we'll get through this in due time. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
When Captain America throws his mighty shield, all those who chose to oppose his shield must yield. If he's led to a fight and a duel...
Shh.